Attention! This video will contain major spoilers for Tears of the Kingdom. If you don't want to get spoiled, I suggest you go and beat the game and come back later. The Legend of Zelda Timeline. When I say those words, 99% of people get a headache. The Zelda Timeline is something that has been debated and talked about and just confuzzled over for literally years. Now, Nintendo has granted us a timeline that they said is official, but it makes literally no bloody sense. To make matters worse, the newest title that's released, Tears of the Kingdom, has seemed to completely shatter that very timeline. But today, we're not tackling the Zelda timeline in its entirety, specifically the craziness that is Tears of the Kingdom's placement. So that being said, guys, sit back and relax and get ready, because today I'm going to be trying to fix Tears of the Kingdom's busted timeline. Okay, first things first, let's set up context. The timeline starts off with Skyward Sword being the first game ever. This then leads to Minish Cap, 4 Swords, and then the big one, Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time has a massive timeline split. This creates 3 separate timelines: the Fallen Hero timeline, the Child timeline, and the Adult timeline. The Fallen timeline is where Link dies in the big bad battle with Ganondorf. The Child timeline is where Link goes back in time and gets to relive his childhood. And then finally, there's the Adult timeline, where Link's sent back to the past and the world is left without a Link, which leads to Ganon's escape from the Sacred Realm, and this leads to Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. Now, fast forward years later, there's Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild has no actual timeline placement at all. The game actually ends up referencing multiple timelines at once. It references the Great Sea via the Rock Salt. It directly references traveling through time and the Twilight Realm itself during Zelda's speech, Breath of the Wild. And finally, we have lots of enemies that were featured in the Fallen timeline, specifically Lynels. This all leads to a conclusion that a lot of people aren't a big fan of, that being the convergence theory, that Breath of the Wild takes place so far down the timeline, an event occurs which brings all 3 branches together into one, which leads into Breath of the Wild. Now, my personal theory is that this actual big convergence was Hyrule Warriors, and Nintendo at any point could very well make that game canon if they wanted to. Now, yes, I know that's not a popular opinion, and I already know that there are a lot of flaws with that idea, but it's the only game that really makes the most sense that could bring all the timelines together that actually has done so on screen. That being said, something obviously happened to make all 3 timelines have some kind of convergence, to the point where Breath of the Wild references all 3 of those timelines. Well, now the context out of the way, let's get into the real problem. Tears of the Kingdom. It's fun, it's amazing, it's a blast. And one of the coolest things about it is its story. However, this also ends up becoming one of its most frustrating aspects. The story of Tears of the Kingdom talks about Zelda ending up way back in the past, during Hyrule's first founding. So that would imply that this would take place during Skyward Sword. However, that's where the problems start to arise. We meet Rauru and Sonia, the first king and queen of Hyrule. We also see the introduction of Ganondorf, as well as some very uncomfortable parallels to Ocarina of Time. This story also directly references the Imprisoning War, something that was featured in Link to the Past, talking about the sages fighting against Ganondorf and sealing him away. They also seem to have no knowledge of the Master Sword at all, but if this is Hyrule's first founding, which should have occurred right after Skyward Sword, they should have at least known, right? This all led a lot of fans to create one of the scariest conclusions ever, that being that this entire story was retconning the vast majority of the Zelda lore and timeline. And it's one that I'm not a big fan of. So let's try and fix things up. Now let's establish a few things. First off, we definitely know, based on Breath of the Wild, that the previous stories and games had to have occurred and had to be canon. How do we know this? Well, let's go back to what I said at the very start of this video. Breath of the Wild references each of the major timelines in major ways. First, there's Zelda's speech, which directly references Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, 2 major events in the timeline that we definitely know that occurred. The Rock Salt and the Rito both exist in Breath of the Wild's timeline, which means the events of Wind Waker had to have occurred, and the Rito had to come into existence in some fashion. And finally, there are the Lynels and other small aspects of that nature, like the Hero of the Wild's tunic, all odd references to the Fallen Hero timeline. And we already know that Breath of the Wild takes place right before the events of Tears of the Kingdom, which means Breath of the Wild, and what it established and said, obviously has to be canon. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Tears of the Kingdom can't retcon the stories of the past, right? Well, actually, there's a really massive piece of evidence in this game that definitely stops the idea of the events Tears of the Kingdom retconning the past, specifically the Master Sword. We know that Fi still exists. Fi is referenced in Breath of the Wild and again in Tears of the Kingdom. She's there, she's alive, and she exists. Fi came into existence because of the events of Skyward Sword. Because of that, we know the events and everything that happened at Skyward Sword had to have occurred. And if that's the case, then Tears of the Kingdom's weird quote about Rauru and Sonia being the founders of this new Hyrule, the first king and queen, doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would they not know what the Master Sword is? Why would there not be any references to it? Another thing that's really odd is when Zelda first goes to the past, when she says her name is Zelda, they don't seem to recognize the name. If this took place all the way back during Skyward Sword's time, Zelda's still a pretty important figure. I mean, she literally was the goddess reincarnate and helped Link establish New Hyrule. So why wouldn't they recognize Zelda's name? Why wouldn't they bring any of that up? And that then leads me to then state what my fix is. What I think actually makes the most sense. When Breath of the Wild came out, they said that all the games that we knew, the timeline that we became accustomed to, was known as the Era of Myth. A time so far back in the past, so far back, that up to this point, it's all left to legend, myth, and no one actually knows the exact events in the game. In the game, they're like not really aware of what truly happened back then, but we do as the player. That being said, they called it an era. A whole era of a section of time that occurred way back in the past, right? So, why not have Tears of the Kingdom's past have a new era? And I think that's what's actually occurring here. Nintendo isn't trying to get rid of or retcon or change the past that they've created. They're not trying to get rid of or change the stories that they've developed all the years. And if they were going to do that, then they wouldn't have made so many direct references to them in the previous title. Instead, I believe what's actually occurring is that they have now done a reset and have started a new era with a new timeline. The Era of Myth occurred, the old Zelda timeline happened, there was a convergence at some point which created a new timeline. It's very possible this convergence, or some kind of mixture of all the three timelines, caused everything to reset, or maybe Hyrule came into ruin, or something happened. So much time passed, a new era was born. The Zonai came down from the sky and descended to create a new Hyrule, and they founded the first Hyrule in that new era. This then leads us to where Tears of the Kingdom takes place. Tears of the Kingdom occurs, a second imprisoning war happens. The first imprisoning war of the era, but the second one for the timeline. As imprisoning wars could be just described as a war where they're trying to imprison, like Ganondorf, which happened in Link to the Past. That would then fix so many things, saying it's in another era, that it's so far disconnected, and so much time has passed that all the previous Hyrules have seemingly been mostly forgotten, and a new Hyrule was created thanks to the Zonai in this new era. Everything falls right back into place, no retconning needed. It still respects the original timeline, the original stories, while allowing Nintendo to have a brand new timeline to work with the future. Saying this entire timeline takes place in a brand new era, totally disconnected from the original stories, and the original stories have next to no bearing, means that now they can create a new Zelda timeline with lore that's just straight on and narrow, with no craziness, that's meant to coincide with each other. In the later years of Nintendo and Zelda as a series, story became more of a thing that they cared about. Skyward Sword was released just to explain lore and story bits that we had questions about. And now, Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity, and Tears of the Kingdom have all taken the time to make sure that the stories work together. Give or take a few little snafus like all the Guardian stuff missing from Tears of the Kingdom. So, let's finally put it all together. At the end of all three major timelines, the Fallen timeline, the Child, and the Adult, there was a convergence. This convergence and or mixing of events occurred where all three timelines had elements that somehow got melded together. During this event, it was cataclysmic, causing Hyrule to effectively encounter a hard reset where it was pretty much destroyed and a lot of the world was mixed all around. Because of this, the world was reset anew, and the Zonai then descended down to the surface and established their own version of Hyrule, which then began the era of the Zonai. After some time, all the Zonai ended up going into hiding or disappearing, and then all of the past events of Tears of the Kingdom take place. Ganon tries to take over the actual land, Rauru seals Ganondorf away, the imprisoning war occurs in that era. Centuries down the road, Ganon's power eventually leaks out of the seal long enough to cause the first Calamity to come into existence. This then leads us to the Calamity returning again in the past of Breath of the Wild, where all of the champions in Link and Zelda lose that fight, which then brings us to Breath of the Wild occurring, and those events play out as we saw in game, which then leads us immediately into Tears of the Kingdom, where Ganondorf breaks out of his sealment, and the rest of the future events of Tears of the Kingdom take place as we saw in game. And then when Tears of the Kingdom wraps up, that finally leaves the timeline open for future titles. And I think this makes the most sense. Having a brand new era is a perfect setup. All this seems to fit perfectly into place. And there's only one little thing that really is an issue, and that's Nintendo themselves. Nintendo has said that it's up to fans to figure out where this game takes place, because I, for some reason, think Nintendo has a weird vendetta against their fans and giving them direct answers. And since Nintendo has not given this an official answer, I think that this whole idea of this being a new era is extremely plausible, but it's not concrete. I'm sure you might be able to poke holes in this theory. I'm sure you'll be able to come up with things that point out why this doesn't make sense. But overall, I think this could very well be what Tears of the Kingdom is. A brand new era for the Zonai, which is totally separate from the era of Myth, which we already played through. And with all that being said, guys, that does bring us to the end of this video. I hope you all enjoyed this look at trying to fix Tears of the Kingdom's busted timeline placement, and if you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and comments. It was always effing amazing. And let me know in the comments below, what do you think? Do you think this whole idea makes sense, there being another era? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? Do you think maybe this is still a retcon, maybe a pseudo remake of Zelda 1 and Zelda 2? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But until then, guys, I'll see you on the next one. Joe6 signing out. Later.